Hello, everyone. We're here to talk to you about HJ2, the official revenue estimate. I'm Sam Schaefer, revenue analyst with the Legislative Fiscal Division.
And I'm Megan Moore. I'm a research analyst with the Legislative Services Division, and I staff the Revenue Interim Committee and the House Taxation Committee. I'm going to start by talking about some of the process things related to the revenue estimate, and then Sam's going to talk about the numbers. So the revenue estimate is an estimate of the general fund revenue and selected non-general fund revenues for the next 3 fiscal years. And this is used in the fiscal notes to estimate the financial impact of bills. And then it's also used to determine whether the budget is balanced, which is a constitutional requirement. The revenue estimate always has the number of HJ2. We reserve that number for it. And the Revenue Interim Committee has a role before session starts related to the revenue estimate. And in November, generally, before a session, the Legislative Fiscal Division and the Governor's Office of Budget and Program Planning present their revenue estimates to the committee. And the committee reviews those presentations and adopts an estimate based on the information they've received. They then direct staff, which is usually me, to draft the resolution, and the sponsor of it pre-introduces it as HJ2. This introduced version of HJ2 is used for the fiscal notes. The assumptions within it are used to estimate the fiscal impact of legislation. There is a unique status for HJ2. When introduced, HJ2 is effective until it's amended. So it's unlike other bills in that when it is amended, those new amendments become effective immediately. And this also means that it doesn't have to make its way through both chambers of the legislature in order for it to be effective.
So this year on November 18th, the Revenue Interim Committee meeting heard revenue estimate recommendations from both the Legislative Fiscal Division and the Governor's Office of Budget and Program Planning, OBPP. Throughout the course of years, there are times when both shops sort of see the future revenue collections in a similar fashion. And then often there are other years when there is a bit of discrepancy between how the two shops may see the world moving forward. I'd say this year was a pretty typical year, whereas the LFD recommendation for total general fund was only 2.1% above the OBPP recommendation. As far as a dollar amount is concerned, that is $216.8 million. Ultimately, what the Revenue Interim Committee decided to do was more or less split the difference on that general fund difference of $216.8 million. And they had an amendment that essentially reduced individual income tax projections from the LFD shop by $108 million over the 3-year period. And when we're talking about a 3-year period, for this instance, we're talking about fiscal year 25, 26, and fiscal 27. And what they ultimately did was reduce the income tax number by $35 million in fiscal 25, $36 million in fiscal 26, and $37 million in fiscal 27 from the LFD number. So after that was done, you can see the resulting, this is a summary table that shows the general fund figures for HJ2. And down second row from the bottom, you can see where it says total general fund. Those will then be the numbers that are used on the legislative balance sheet throughout the course of the upcoming legislative session. You can see in the second column from the left, you can see the amounts that were collected in fiscal 24, which has concluded for each of those sources, and then what was adopted by the RIC committee back in November for fiscal 25, 26, 27. The sources listed here are the top 6 sources in the general fund, and then we lump the remaining about 27 sources together at the bottom. You can see there is an ongoing general fund subtotal, as well as one-time only revenue, which we have categorized down in this row right here. When we look at ongoing general fund growth under the adoption of HJ2, we're expecting a decline of 1.7% in fiscal 25, then 6% growth in fiscal 26, and about 2.4% growth in fiscal year 2027. This chart is very similar to the figures you saw in the previous table, but this shows HJ2 as adopted for general revenues. So the previous table that we looked at a second ago was general fund only. When we talk about general revenues, we're talking about the general fund sources, as well as the state levied 95 mills that are distributed to a state special fund for the purpose of school equalization. And then this chart also includes interest that is earned on treasury cash, which is in a state special fund for fiscal 23, 24, and 25. But then that interest reverts back to the general fund in fiscal 26 and 27. Some of these changes were made in the last legislative session. So in order to get a really accurate depiction of revenue collections over the course of the past decade or so, it makes sense to include those state special funds as well. And you can see moving forward in the green lines, these were the forecasts for those general revenues adopted in HJ2 for fiscal 25 of about 3.76 billion up to 3.97 billion, and then about 4.06 billion in fiscal year 2027. And you can see the corresponding growth rates for these general revenues, which include, like I said, the 95 mills that are levied by the state, as well as interest on treasury cash in fiscal 25 of negative 1.2%, 5.6%, and 2.2% for ongoing revenue growth. When we're talking about ongoing revenue growth, we're saying what would we expect this year and next year and the year after that. We're not talking about those revenues or transfers into the general fund that are considered one-time only. This is a pie chart that sort of shows what sources make up the bulk of our general revenues. You can see the lion's share of the pie is individual income tax, which over the 2027 biennium is expected to account for just under 57% of total general revenues, followed by the state levy 95 mills, which is property tax that goes to, like I said, a state special fund for the purpose of school equalization, followed by corporate income tax, vehicle taxes and fees, insurance tax, video gambling taxes, and oil and natural gas taxes. These here are what we generally consider to be our top 7 general revenue sources. And you can see, like I said earlier, there's about 27 additional smaller sources that account for the remaining 11.7% of general revenues. Since individual income tax makes up such a large share of general revenues, we're going to take a quick look at it here. You can see in this chart or this graph that in fiscal 2021 and fiscal 2022, this source saw extremely strong growth. However, over the course of the past 2 years and continuing into fiscal 25, we expect this source to continue sort of its flat, actually more of a slight decrease for the past few years. I will say that the decrease we've experienced going back to fiscal 22 is to some extent, and maybe a rather large extent, a result of legislation that was passed in the 2021 and 2023 legislative sessions that reduced individual income tax rates. The first full year where those individual income tax reductions will be felt is primarily in fiscal 25. And then once those have worked their way into the system, you can see that growth in the out years is then more or less in line with the growth that was experienced from about 2010 up through about 2020. Very similar growth patterns. They would always almost be parallel if you looked at them on top of one another. One would just be elevated. So HJ2 in context compared to history and a couple other metrics that we use in the revenue estimating and budgeting process. This purple line shows the general revenue growth indexed back to fiscal year 2002. In comparison to this yellow line, which shows the growth of inflation or CPI and population together, and then compared to statewide personal income growth, which is this sort of brown line. Under quote unquote, I'd say maybe boring or normal economic conditions, our general revenues generally run above CPI and population, but below personal income. But there are years when it may approach that personal income line, or when it may dip below this CPI and population line. And usually there's an explanation for why that may have happened. This shows the same chart with these explanations that I was talking about. You can see back in the early to mid 2000s, the Bakken oil boom out in eastern Montana caused revenue collections to be very, very strong for quite a few years. During that period, our general revenues were growing maybe slightly even above statewide personal income. Then the Great Recession hit, and those general revenues dropped considerably, actually down below our inflation and population line. Then for a few years, it kind of ran between the two of them, like we would expect. In fiscal 2017, commodity prices fell, and Montana had sort of its own mini recession. And there was actually a special session in the fall of, I believe, 2017 to address that. Then we returned to the middle of those two lines until we saw a very strong run up following and during the pandemic of revenues. And then, due to the income tax reductions that I spoke to previously from the last two sessions, you can see this sort of flattening of growth in these out years before returning to a line sort of between the two. I will note that if these income tax reductions did not occur, our general revenues would have been growing a lot closer to the statewide personal income growth that you see here. And it would have sort of been doing that maybe on its own, whereas in other times when we saw these run-ups, it was due to, the oil boom or some of the federal stimulus that not only in Montana, but many states caused revenue collections to increase substantially. So this is just some context on how revenues grow relative to other economic indicators. Like I said, typically our revenues are between the statewide personal income line and a little bit above inflation and population. Right now, that seems to be the case again. But once again, it's a result of legislation passed in the last two legislative sessions, or else it would be, I'd say, higher than what we would typically expect. So with that, we're here to take any questions if you have them, or feel free to contact us later.